when we look at each other, that's only 10% of what's really going on. 90% of what's happening on the inside is what's impacting us the most.
Well, one of the things that you and I talked about before was that grief kind of looks like an iceberg.
Yes.
And I think that's really important to talk about, because I think one of the reasons why people don't necessarily seek out help when they're going through the grieving process, we feel like this is part of life, right? You would say death
Mm-hmm.
is part of life, and these things are
Mm-hmm.
part of life, and I should just be able to deal with it. And it can be a really difficult thing to navigate.
Mm-hmm.
It can be really hard to understand what's happening to you, what's going on in your, mind, what's going on in your life, and start to recognize that there are things that are being impacted that you didn't realize were connected to the grief.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk about that iceberg analogy? I love analogies. So I loved when
I
you
do
brought
too.
this up. So can you
Mm-hmm.
talk about the iceberg analogy and how that relates to the experience of grief?
Yes. An iceberg, what we see above sea level is only 10%. So there's a 90% of portion of that iceberg that we don't see that's under sea level. And I really didn't know that until I started studying that. And that's very, very interesting. And it represents us as individuals. So what we're looking at when we look at each other, that's only 10% of what's really going on. 90% of what's happening on the inside is what's impacting us the most. And that's what I find out about that 90%. When I'm working with people one-on-one, that 90% is going to come to surface. And I help people connect the dots and recognize you haven't dealt with the fact that you went through a divorce, or that you were molested, or that you were raped. You lost your identity, your innocence, your security, all of that. So yeah, that iceberg theory, I try to explain it to people. And when I do, they say, oh, I didn't realize that was even a thing. And it kind of makes them feel a little bit more comfortable to go within to deal with that 90%.
Yeah. And what are some of the things that you do with people? Because I've had loss of, like, my father died about 18 years ago. He was very young. He was, well, I think very young, 54 years old. He was quite young, and he was very healthy man. Like, he'd never had any issues until he got cancer, and then he died. And that grief was a different experience from the loss of our child. We had a young adult son, my stepson, who passed away from, died by suicide. And that grief was so unpredictable, and it was so difficult to navigate, because there were so many things. One of the things that I don't think people think about in any type of loss is all the other stuff that comes up with it. I was going through days where all of a sudden all of these memories from his childhood would come up, and I would be remembering all the times when I made mistakes as a mom, and I wish that I had done things differently and had no way to resolve them. And then there were days when I was really, really angry. I was angry about all kinds of stuff. And it would feel like it came out of the blue. And I'm like, what is the matter with me? And we say there's no trigger, well, nothing happened. I don't know why I'm feeling like this. But how do you help people learn how to navigate those experiences? Because it really feels very unpredictable and unsettling and disorienting.
Yes. The biggest thing that I find that I have to help people do is really acknowledge the grief and give them permission to grieve.
Yeah.
Because of the beliefs that have plagued our lives a lot of times. What is a belief that is hurting a lot of people, that we have to be strong and not cry. So once I encourage them that it is okay to cry and to express their grief, and then they find themselves in that space, and then really just digging deep within the space to understand their different types of grief. So and every loss, again, demands a response, and every loss is going to be experienced differently. But what impacts that process of grief is the type of grief, normal grief versus complicated grief. So you mentioned your stepson, how he died. He was young, died by suicide. So that puts you in what we call complicated grief. And you had trauma, because not all grief experiences are traumatic. Versus another example, true, would be my cousin's grandmother 98 years old. And she loved to pray. She was a praying woman. She died praying on her knees. What a way to go. So
Yeah.
normal, that would be a case of normal grief. How we would process her is going to be totally different of how we process your stepson. Yeah. So the types of grief will impact our process.
Well, and how can somebody identify that they are in grief? I think that's one of the things that when we have a lot of these emotional experiences, we love to slap labels on them. Anxiety disorder, depressive disorder, major depressive disorder. And we call them disorders.
Mm-hmm.
When in fact, often what's actually happening is the brain is functioning the way that it's meant to, and we just aren't understanding what the brain's trying to say to us.
Absolutely.
So how does somebody identify, like, I think I'm grieving? How would somebody identify that?
That can be challenging because it just depends upon who they are also connected to, like the doctors that you mentioned. So hopefully they will have space in their life to where they get connected with a counselor, a therapist, someone who understands what grief is and to be able to explain that to them. Because we can't apply what we don't know. There can't be any type of transformation if there is no application of any information that we get, but we've got to get the information first. So when you start feeling and seeing these different things, my encouragement to you is to reach out and ask somebody, is this normal? I get that asked a lot. Is this normal? I don't know what this is. I say, this is grief. Your body's responding to grief.
Yeah. So can we go back a little bit with your experience with your the loss of your marriage?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that looked like and how you got to the point where you realized, I need some help? Like, can you walk us through that?
Yes, because at that point I had reached my rock bottom, what I call my rock bottom. And I think all of us will have that type of experience in life. But it was so devastating because my faith again was challenged at that moment because I had prayed about all the other losses. And then I got to this and I'm a pastor's wife and I'm like, oh my gosh, my faith is not strong enough, kind of like what you experienced. So that's why I readily admitted myself into the mental health hospital. And that was such a great experience for me. Believe it or not, Michelle, I actually had, it strengthened my faith. It really, really did. God is okay with our emotions. He created them. So I went to inpatient therapy. And then after that, I was in outpatient therapy for 30 days. So it really helped me to understand self-care and the importance of it, especially when you're in grief. Especially when you're in grief.